going to get started with a few introductory comments before we get to the main event of today, learning from Bridgett Johnson-Pride about developing the Black Queer Studies Archive, study guide at the Schomburg Center. So I am Marissa Petru, Director of the Guilbeau Center for Public History and Assistant Professor of History at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. And I'm currently on sabbatical in Germany. I first want to welcome you all to our final event in our Queering the Collection speaker series. Thank you all for coming. We are absolutely delighted to have Bridgett Johnson-Pride as our guest speaker and are thrilled that she rescheduled this event with us. This series is organized in support of the university's new LGBTQ+ archive. These projects have been generously funded by the American Library Association, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Guilbeau Center, the Guilbeau Charitable Trust. Excuse me. The title of this series was inspired by Emily Drabinski's 2013 article, Queering the Catalog, which is now standard reading in museum studies and public history courses. This series of speakers will provide expert insight into archiving materials in queer history and culture and how to apply queer theory to create more inclusive accessioning and cataloging systems, to support inclusive research projects, and to generally create more equitable experiences at institutions of collection. A few reminders: we will be keeping the chat disabled for this event. If you have questions, please take advantage of the Q&A forum. We have put in a number of safety measures in place, as you probably noticed as you filled out the lengthy registration form, which also went through a manual review. But please continue to be your respectful selves in the Q&A forum. Bridgett will answer questions that you have after the talk during the Q&A portion of the event. In case you have to leave early, the recording of this event will be made available for you to view on the Guilbeau Center YouTube channel. And before we get started, I would also like to take a moment to acknowledge that UL Lafayette is on the land of the Attakapat Ishak, and we honor the Attakapat Ishak and the land with gratitude. We would also like to express our gratitude to elders, past, present, and future, of the dozens of other First Nations in the Louisiana area, including the Chitimacha, Tunica Biloxi, Jina Choctaw, Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians, Coushatta, Appaloosa, and Kanesee Naday Band of Lipan Apache. We also honor the enslaved peoples of African descent who worked this land when it was part of the Mouton family's sugar plantation. This acknowledgement was created in consultation with elders and leaders of tribal nations and descendant communities. And now I'm going to turn things over to my co-organizer, Zachary Stein, Head of Special Collections at UL's Dupre Library, who will introduce our speaker for this evening.
All right, thanks very much. So yeah, as Dr. Petru mentioned, I am Zach Stein, the Head of Special Collections and Assistant Professor at Edith Garland Dupre Library at University of Louisiana at Lafayette. And it is my pleasure and honor to introduce tonight's speaker. So, and actually, before I do that, I also just want to mention we do have a survey that at the end of this presentation, if you could fill that out, and it would just give us some insight on the kinds of on what worked, what could be improved on, and how we can continue doing these kinds of events later in the future. So I will be posting that. So yeah, if you could fill that out, that'd be great. So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure and honor to introduce tonight's speaker. Bridgett Catherine Johnson-Pride is the Reference Services Librarian for Houghton, I hope I pronounced that correctly, Houghton Library at Harvard University, a member of the inaugural class of Cultural Heritage Fellows for Rare Book School, and an artist who enjoys teaching with primary sources and empowering young learners to embark on personal discovery in the archives. Ms. Pride received her MLIS and MA in history from Simmons University in 2018. She was part of the Diversity, Equity, Race, Accessibility, and Identity in LIS, also known as DERAIL, forum, and was the 2018 project manager. Formerly, she was the reference librarian for the Manuscripts, Archives, and Rare Books Division of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, where she created a portfolio of research guides celebrating Black history, including two of her most popular guides, By Any Means Necessary, documenting the history of Black protest at the Schomburg Center, and Exploring LGBTQ+ collections at the Schomburg Center. Ms. Pride studies 19th and 20th century American culture, especially relating to intersectional identities with gender, race, and class. So without further ado, I introduce Ms. Bridgett Johnson-Pride.
Thank you so much. Just bear with me while I pull up my screen share. All right. So thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this series of presentations. And thank you to everyone who has taken the time to join today. This presentation has been some time in the making. I want to especially thank Marissa and Zach for your attention and care to make sure that we can share this space and learn together this evening. So as was mentioned, my name is Bridgett Johnson-Pride, and I'm currently the Interim Associate Librarian for Public Services at Houghton Library at Harvard. This is new, so nobody was expected to know that. Today, one second. Okay. Today, I will be giving a presentation titled Exploring Queer Collections at the Schomburg Center. And this presentation is meant to share some of the challenges that I encountered while I was building a research guide that would help Schomburg Center researchers locate collections that were created by or were about Black queer folks. I completed this guide in May of 2020 as my first big project completed during the pandemic. At the time, I was the reference librarian for the Manuscripts, Archives, and Rare Books Division of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, the Schomburg Center is located in Harlem, New York. It's one of 4 research libraries within the New York Public Library System, meaning it's open to the public and you don't have to be a professor or professional to come and use the collections there. They're open to everyone. The Schomburg is organized by material format, which sometimes made research challenging because depending on what types of documents you wanted to work with, whether that was film, photos, art, letters, etc., you had to make arrangements with that specific research division, even though they were all in the same building. So I began working at the Schomburg Center in April of 2019. During my orientation, my cohort of new hires was taken to the main library on 42nd Street for a tour. At the time, they had an exhibit titled Stonewall 50 that was supposed to be celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall riots and LGBTQ history. I was surprised to learn that while there were some images of queer BIPOC folks, the collections chosen to represent the exhibit primarily documented the experiences of gay white men. As I settled into my position at the Schomburg Center, I kept referring back to the research guide created by the exhibition curator, looking for connections between our 2 repositories. I was disappointed that it failed to point users to collections at the Schomburg that could provide a different point of view and address the complications of intersectional identities of being both Black and queer. Furthermore, I began taking note of how frustrating it was to use the New York Public Library catalog and the tools that were available. When researchers would come to me trying to write papers on Black queer individuals, they were confused, I was confused, we all had a lot to learn. And the guide that was available at the time didn't really give many helpful searching tips. So I set about answering this question: how do our researchers find queer Black people in the archives? So I chose a research guide as the tool that I would use to explain to our researchers how to conduct this research. I said researcher so many times, sorry. I also use this guide to explain the weaknesses and biases of library cataloging and to point to collections through the Schomburg Center, New York Public Library, and eventually list other repositories that could also aid in learning more about the queer community. So now I want to talk about everything I learned, or at least some of it, during this process that both made me want to throw up my hands and admit defeat, but also made me want to dig in my heels and light the way for my baby researcher queers. So let's get started. The Manuscripts, Archives, and Rare Books Division, or MARV, as we called ourselves, used a really amazing tool that I think more archives should implement. It was a list of collections organized by subject headings. And this was a 47-page long PDF that listed all 950 plus collections under relevant subject headings. Sometimes the collection would be listed multiple times under different subject headings, if that made sense. We had subject headings like Harlem Renaissance, authors, activism, enslavement, and queer studies. On this slide, you will see all of the collections at the Schomburg Center that currently are listed under the queer studies subject heading. This list was a lot shorter when I first started, which prompted me to write the following blurb for the research guide. So this says, within our list of collections categorized by subject, we include the subject queer studies. The queer studies list identifies collections created by LGBTQIA+ individuals and organizations about the study of queerness. This distinction does not identify every collection within the division created by a person or organization who identifies as part of the LGBTQIA+ community. If the materials within a collection do not discuss the LGBTQIA+ community, it would not be assigned a subject heading that identifies the collection as part of the queer studies category, even if the author identifies as LGBTQ. So when I first started, people like James Baldwin were missing from this list. We know him as a famous gay, and he wasn't listed under this subject heading where our researchers were looking for him. It took about a year before he and similar collections were included in this list. However, there are still folks who are missing. We search for and use subject headings in the NYPL catalog when we're doing research. But at NYPL, there's very little effort to try to be consistent with subject headings for these collections, resulting in low counts of use for each heading. forcing researchers to work extra hard to choose exactly the correct combination of words to find what they need. So here I've put side by side the list of subject terms for the In the Life archive and the Cheryl Clark papers. So for those of you who don't know, Cheryl Clark was a lesbian and activist. So a minority lesbian and sexual minority, and yet the only subject headings used to describe her as such is African American lesbian. So we're missing some opportunities to incorporate additional subject headings to ease in the research process. Another frustration or challenge that I encountered was representation in general. There were far more collections about Black gay men than women, and even fewer collections from the point of view of Black trans folks and bisexuals. With all of this in mind, I felt it was important to make our users aware of the biases in cataloging. At NYPL, there is an effort to engage in restorative cataloging to replace derogatory language that shames communities with terminology that is not harmful. I also felt it was important to point our users to homosaurus.org to help them broaden the terms that they used when searching. Finally, I spent many hours compiling a list of terms that were used in the NYPL catalog so that our users had a hefty list to start their search from. So next, let's talk about digitized collections. That's what everybody wants. And that's really what we were relying on when we were closed during the pandemic. So first, I want to share that while I was gathering screenshots for this presentation, I learned that there have been some updates to how the digital collections display. They have this wonderful feature where you can just browse. And they started adding subject headings to browse under. Revolutionary, I know. And so on the screen is what you can browse under the subject heading Gay and Lesbian History. So things that we need to think about as librarians, as archivists, and as researchers is what is this showing us and what is this not showing us? So what you see on the slides are the 8 collections that NYPL has identified for digitization to document gay and lesbian history. So the questions that we need to ask are, whom are the creators who are being represented? And then also, where are these collections actually located? So I did my homework. These creators are all white. These collections only represent those at the Stephen A. Schwartzman building. So none of the Schomburg collections show up here, which could mean a couple of things. It could mean that no collections created by Black queer creators have been deemed necessary, relevant, important enough to be digitized, or they could have just been left out under the subject heading. So we don't know unless we start digging. During the pandemic, NYPL claimed they would spend the next few years prioritizing collections created by Black people in the next, to be next in line for digitization. We can see here that so far, Black voices documenting gay and lesbian history are absent, unless they're being documented from the white lens. While these collections do include photographs of Black people, we have to be aware and think about and question how the white gaze has chosen to capture these individuals. So there are also very few collections at the Schomburg Center that allow for Black trans people to share their stories. So here you can see 3 collections, all using different subject headings to identify them. A part of the Stonewall 50 research guide does point users towards the NYC Trans Oral History Project that the Schwarzman Library partners with. The Schomburg Center and NYPL as a whole can do much better, though, at documenting the experiences of trans people. I would even like to challenge them to make that a collecting priority over the next few years. So one of the next kind of hot button topics I want to bring up is the topic of trigger warnings. So over the final few slides, I want to shift our thinking a little. I've shared a lot about absences and how they relate to the finding of collections. But now I want to talk about what happens when we are doing that research and are faced with disturbing descriptions of violence or graphic nudity. I would love to hear from some of you during the Q&A about how you deal with these things in your collections, or what you thought when you came across these types of things during your research. And how would you feel if you came across a trigger warning in a finding aid or in a folder that you were looking at? And have you come across trigger warnings during your research? In the past, I was always very casual about how, yes, of course, we should use trigger warnings. But then I was doing some research for a blog I co-authored with my former colleague, Zakia Collier, who you should please look up on Twitter. She's absolutely fabulous. The blog was for Pride Month, and we were mirroring the theme, The Fight Continues, that New York City's Pride Parade was adopting as their theme for that year. I was looking through the In the Life archive, created by former Schomburg curator Stephen Fullwood, who you should also follow, and was reading through a section on police brutality. I will spare you the details, but even though I was looking for this evidence, I personally was not prepared for the graphic descriptions that I came across, especially as we were still very actively talking and marching due to the recent murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and the other members of the Black community who were stolen from us before their time. I also don't want to further stigmatize the queer community with trigger warnings. Not every collection requires a trigger warning, and I also don't want to label porn and violence as the same. But not everyone has the appetite to stumble upon these topics without warning. I like a little informed consent. I by no means want to make it harder to access this material either. I don't want to restrict it. So I'm curious, in a few minutes, I'd like to know your take, how you deal with these topics in your collections and research. Another topic for discussion is the act of outing someone who has passed. An example I would like to use is Lorraine Hansberry, whose papers are at the Schomburg, parts of which speak of relationships she had with other women and very sapphic writing. The Hansberry estate has put restrictions on some of this material. When it was first acquired, the restrictions were not there. People used and saw the material, but now special permission is required to use it, and it's not always granted. The estate has really locked down certain parts because they wanted to protect Hansberry's image. I also recently took a class with Rare Book School titled The 6 Degrees of Phyllis Wheatley, where we mused on the possible evidence that Phyllis may have been in a romantic relationship with a good female friend. In this course, we threw around the phrase of minding the business of others. So once again, I'm asking the question, what do we do when we have this evidence? Is it our responsibility to out folks who may have passed? How do we manage those relationships with donors, with family? Who has the right to this information? What is the truth, and who should have access to it? I've spent a lot of time talking about the challenges and the questions that I wrestled with while creating this research guide. But I also want to mention a small part of what I think was done well. And that was highlighting where our users could look for more information and more evidence of queer history. This list should be longer and could be, but I don't work at New York Public Library anymore, so I can't add to it. But I hope that someone takes this up to provide needed updates. I want to encourage you to take a look at these institutions and share them with your users. I'm a firm believer that sharing this type of information can save lives. To start closing us out, and before I open it up to questions, I want to share some takeaways. First, I believe that it is our responsibility as archivists and librarians to make sure that our collections are documenting even the most marginalized communities. We should be teaching our users how to use the tools available and strive to make improvements or better tools, and do the work to discover the biases of our institutions and create change. Finally, we must approach this work with the utmost respect for the communities that we are documenting. We must make it a priority to establish community partners, because our collections, like these communities, are not stagnant. So I want to thank you for spending this time for me today, and I would love to answer any questions or hear about your collections or research. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Bridgett. So I'm really curious to hear from the audience your experiences or answers to the questions that Bridgett posed. So please take advantage of the Q&A forum or post any questions you have for Bridgett regarding this talk. So while you're collecting your thoughts, I had some time to collect my thoughts earlier. Okay, so I'm not sure. So I have two questions. Not sure which one to go with first. Okay, let's start with this first one. Let's say, so how do we guide archivists of different research centers? Oh, okay, sorry. Well, we have a question from Suzanne Wiltz, so I'm going to put this up there first. Okay, so Suzanne Wiltz asked, what was the most surprising item you found in the archives while doing your research?
Oh goodness. I think probably when I was doing research for the blog that I co-authored, we were trying to find collection material that represented the theme, "The Fight Continues." So part of that was looking at police brutality, economic concerns, the basic fight for rights and human dignity. And one thing that really helped me um, make connections between collections was finding all of these flyers for rent parties. Just because that wasn't something I would think about, like, and that shows my privilege. So sorry. But like that wasn't something I thought about as being so widespread. But in so many collections, there were like little flyers for rent parties, or people were talking about like selling beers to pay the rent, or people were throwing fundraisers for Stormy DeLavrier's legal fees so that she didn't get kicked out of the apartment she was living in. So kind of finding the evidence of these like economic disparities that like are a thing, but like the evidence of how the community would come together to fight together, to help save each other and make sure people were safe, was surprising, heartening, just a beautiful peek into the community that I think a lot of folks still struggle with.
Thank you. I always love asking that question too. So thank you, Suzanne, for your question. So our next question is from Barbara Cohen Stratner. Hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Relating to your description of restorative cataloging, are these changes staff driven? Can you give some examples?
So I did not work in cataloging when I was there, so I heard about it, but I wasn't truly involved. As far as I am aware, it was staff driven. So usually staff members would be hired and they'd be like, this is super problematic. Can we fix it? And you would form a committee with like-minded staff and create a proposal to have language changed. We see this a lot in archives recently. I know Jessica Ty at the Beinecke Library has been working on restorative description for Japanese internment survivors. And there's just a lot of different projects out there that are working on really similar projects. Soon in March, I'm a part of a workshop with Rare Book School, who will be inviting folks to lead a workshop on a reparative description. So please look for more information on that out of Rare Book School. We're still trying to nail down who our workshop speakers will be. But we just submitted the paperwork to try to get that off the ground. But yeah, there's a lot to learn. There's a lot to fix. And it just takes people being open to change and willing to put in the effort to really describe why some of the language we're using is offensive, derogatory, outdated. So there's a lot of work to be done.
Thank you. So we have some more questions coming in. So the next question is from Emily Gallagher. I'm curious about this idea of minding the business of others and how to honor aspects of a past person's life that they kept private while alive. Knowing that they may have only kept queer relationships private or hidden due to stigma, or even as a result of repression from family members or others who may now control their estate? How do we balance their privacy with the desire for people in present day to know of queer ancestors?
That is the question. And I don't have the answer. I've gone back and forth about this so much. Like when I was creating the guide, like I wanted to like point to it and just be like, hey, there are people that are in our collections that lived closeted lives. And is it my job to point them out? Is that disrespectful? Like I don't want to be disrespectful, but I also like I just wish I could like sit down with the person and just be like, so what do you want? Like I know what your grandchildren want, but what do you want? And there's just no right answer. So I mean, I would encourage us all to talk to our families, our chosen families, our families, and find out like what is your legacy? How do you identify yourself? When, like, if it were safe to do so, what would you do? Um, and we can have those conversations with the people that are still with us. And until then, we can keep debating whether or not it is our job to mind the business of others and out our queer ancestors. But we should always be doing it out of with the utmost respect. And something I didn't talk about in this presentation, but should be mentioned, is how are we identifying our trans ancestors? When, like, should we ever use dead names in cataloging, even if we're calling the collection by their chosen name? Should we write a reference with their dead name, or are we trying to forget that? What is the right answer? So that's something I'm asking my colleagues over at Houghton right now, because there is definitely at least one collection where they use the dead name of the person as the title of the collection, which I think is wrong. But again, like, what is the right answer?
Yeah, I was just typing a lot of notes. Okay, so we have a question from Sarah Pate. Can you tell us more about your new position and some of your projects there?
Sure. So I've been at Houghton Library for 6 months. I was promoted 2.5 months in. So I am now the Associate Librarian for Public Services. So I am the head of the Public Services Department. I run the reading room. I supervise a staff of 12, but give or take. There's been a lot of fluctuation. And it's really taken me out of library work, which is hard. I love making research guides. I love hosting events. I love working with researchers. But I do a lot more HR work, supporting my colleagues with projects, a lot of supervision, a lot of writing policies for the library, scheduling, all of that stuff, which I love. I do love it. But it's a change. But come see me, it's great. Houghton's a fun place. We have an exhibit up now titled American Drag. And I would love to hear thoughts about it.
Okay, so I'm going to ask a question that could build on points you brought up. A recurring topic in the series is the relationship between mainstream universities, libraries, museums, archives, and the queer community, including one, the historical lack of support by mainstream institutions for queer history and the queer community. Two, the extensive work done by the queer community over the last several decades to document queer history in community archives. Three, efforts of community organizations to build relationships and support queer research in university and museum archives. And four, future plans of the American LGBTQ plus museum. So what does this picture look like in terms of Black women's history? How is queer history also Black women's history? How should that inform how and what we collect? And also, how is this history, what overlaps do we see in terms of representing Black women's history in mainstream institutions as well, when we compare this to representing queer history?
So a few years ago, I gave a talk at Salem State University on intersectionality in the archives. And we have to remember that it exists. Myself, my wife, many people hold multiple identities as both Black, female, queer, lots of other things, disabled. Like, there's so many identities, so many hats that we all wear all the time. And it does us a disservice to try to separate them. We are whole people, in spite of our many hats. Thankfully, because of our many hats, we are beautiful, complex people. So I think it's important to maintain multiple types of relationships with multiple communities. We can simultaneously support every member of the queer community in all of their beautifulness. We can support every gender. We can support people of varying socioeconomic backgrounds. There are pockets of communities that do sometimes focus on those narrow identities, but then you can bring them all into one space and you can weave through those identities to create a picture, a larger picture of New York, of California, Massachusetts, of the United States, of the world. So it becomes our jobs to make sure that we are being respectful, that we are highlighting individuals and their messy, complicatedness, and recognize that we are in this together. I showed a list of maybe 15, maybe not so many, institutions that collect queer materials. There are more institutions. There are so many basements and garages that also have materials that could find a home if only we could trust the institutions with the money to provide a lasting home. There's a lot of mistrust, and that's really the root of it, I think, with marginalized communities, is we have so often been pushed to the sidelines, been given death sentences by our government and institutions, that we can't trust the people with the resources to keep our history alive. So it's important for us to teach those communities how to do it. We don't have to take people's stuff. We can host workshops. We can provide oral history collecting booths or kits to let people go out into the community and record Thanksgiving meals or Sunday brunch or whatever. We can give back to these communities the resources that they need to collect their own history until we can repair the mistrust and create a collaboration. Collaboration is so important in making sure that these histories can live on for the future. So that was a lot, I'm sorry.
That was great. Thank you so much. Okay, so do we have any final questions for Bridgett before we conclude for the evening? Okay, so I just want to thank you, Bridgett, so much. This was super helpful. I think especially your answer to the last question for me was really helpful for thinking about next steps for this project, recording the collection and the LGBTQ plus archive work that we're doing at UL and how what we're doing at UL, what we can do to help support the community moving forward. So I found this really helpful. I'm really grateful to you and all the work that you've done. And I certainly wish we could have brought all the UL library and archive staff here to listen. Definitely can relate to the difficulties of being a researcher and being like, where is everything? Why is it there? That makes no sense. So yeah, thank you so much for everything you've been doing. Yeah, I really appreciate it. And to the rest of you, thank you for attending. If you have any questions for us about the project, I'm just going to put our email addresses in the chat, and you can email Zach and me at any time.
And also, please remember, I posted the survey in the chat, so if you could please fill that out, it'd be very, very helpful for us.
Yeah, thank you, Zach. Yeah. And so the recording will be made available on the Guilbeau Center YouTube channel. So again, thank you all for joining us. Okay, we have a note from Emily that the survey is not accepting responses.
Oh, sorry about that. I will fix that right now.
Thank you, Emily, so much for that. Thank you, Zach, for looking into that. Okay, and so with that, I wish you a lovely evening. It's about 1 a.m. for me, so I'm gonna go to bed. So everyone take care and enjoy. Oh, Zach, did you get the survey up?
Yeah, it will accept surveys. It will accept responses now. Sorry about that.
Fantastic. Okay. Okay, so thanks everybody, and have a great night.